and Dish. Dessert and Dish is our weekly interview segment here at St. George's, where we invite real people to dish on the real challenges and blessings of living faithful lives. We always feature a dessert. It's often local or homemade, although not always. And that's because, in my experience anyway, dessert always makes good conversation that much better, and because we all need a little reminder of the sweetness of the kingdom of God already at work in our midst. I'm so excited not only to be back live streaming Dessert and Dish this week, but also to welcome Jeremy Elliott and to welcome my co-host for this evening, Canon David Harrison. I'm going to say more about both Jeremy and David in a moment, but first of all, we do have to take a moment to also introduce our dessert. And so tonight's dessert is a real back to basics sort of affair. We're having brownies. I feel like the theme of desserts lately over the past few weeks for Dessert and Dish has been stuff that's getting us through lockdown and online school.
Okay.
And my kids were pretty excited to wake up this morning and find out that there were brownies, although then they weren't as happy to find out that they had to wait to eat them. So they're going to be glad to eat the brownies tomorrow, and it's going to help us at home. And I hope that you guys enjoy some brownies tonight.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Don't eat them all, I guess.
Don't eat them all. You have to leave at least 2 for the kids back home. You know, take some pity.
Okay.
Long days on Zoom for the kids. So let me take a moment now that we have our dessert. You can take your dessert if you want. I mean, it's up to you. To introduce, first of all, Jeremy. So Jeremy's become a pretty well-known name around St. George's. The brownies are good? Good.
It's very good.
Jeremy has been kind of the brains behind our better technology here at St. George's and the improvements that we've been able to make to the video and the sound for our Sunday and tonight our Wednesday live stream services. Jeremy is the general manager for PSI here in St. Catharines, Production Services Industry, and he's been a big help here at St. George's. So welcome, Jeremy. I'm so glad that you can join us for this conversation. David Harrison is a priest in the Diocese of Toronto. He's currently working on his Doctor of Ministry, examining the spiritual, theological, and experiential implications of online Eucharistic services. And David and I have worked together on a number of different projects for the Anglican Church of Canada over the years. And I thought it would be really interesting, given your research, to have you part of this conversation with Jeremy tonight. Now, I want to just get into our topic for this evening by talking about a word that we throw around a lot lately, specifically in the past year and a half, and that's the word virtual. So we've really gotten into the habit of referring to our online services as virtual services, but now we're really trying to get out of that habit, because there's something about that word virtual that suggests that what we're doing isn't real. And of course, online services are real, and they're also not going anywhere. Whether we're in this pandemic a little bit longer, or whether, back to normal is right around the corner, online services aren't going anywhere. So Jeremy, I'd love to start with you and just hear a little bit from you about how you see the realness of online worship and what you kind of see the landscape looking like as we go forward out of COVID. Just like a few big questions.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that, the only word I like less than virtual is probably pivot, because I think both of those words have been overused in the last year. I think you're absolutely right that it's not going anywhere, and to move away from the concept of virtual makes a lot of sense, because I think that when online worship is done well, that people are not experiencing it as a less than.
Right.
And I think that is really where we're headed and need to be headed. I think younger people often say PIX or it didn't happen. And I think that's similar, that same idea is true for streaming worship. If we're not sharing that more widely or beyond the physical walls of the church, then we're missing a huge opportunity, and we'll continue to experience the challenge of declining attendance and closing churches and all the rest. So I think that you're right, it's not going anywhere. I like the idea that we move away from virtual as a word.
Yeah. So, you really see a connection between some of those questions around, how we reach out more broadly and.
Yeah, I think that there's a disconnect. I think a lot of people, or a lot of churches, are wondering what's wrong as they interact with their bank on their phone and as they connect with their family on Instagram, and so the answer is right there. I often think if someone was asking God, like, what can we do? What do we need? And God said, well, here it is, right? We've got high-speed internet. We have multiple cameras that can be controlled by one person. We have digital consoles that allow for discrete live and broadcast mixes. And the great thing is you can do that for free online. And then the response seems to be, no, that's not it. And so I think that we really have the tools available to us right now to reach more people than perhaps the Anglican Church has ever reached. And we need to look at it like that, not as a nice to have, but as a need to have.
Yeah, I like that. Not a nice to have, but a need to have. Okay. So David, I won't use the word pivot because we've already established that word has been exhausted, but you made quite an interesting response, I think, in your Doctor of Ministry research as we were going into COVID. You kind of changed your focus question as you were seeing what was happening in terms of online worship, and particularly how that was affecting our ability to worship Eucharistically. Can you just share with us a little bit about your research and kind of the questions that you've been asking, and maybe give us a few snapshots of how you've heard the response to that realness of online worship?
My work is really a case study in the parish I've just concluded my ministry at Toronto, which was a very Eucharistically centered parish with a daily Eucharist and 3 on Sundays. So my question, as you said, it did the P word to the question of what does that mean for people who are so used to receiving the sacrament,
right?
When you can't. And so I've done a deep dive with that community, and what I'm discovering is that there's a certain set of people for whom, if it can't be in person, they're not interested, and that is maybe about a third to a half. For the other folks, the question really isn't whether there's a substitute for that, because I think the reality is, you cannot receive bread and wine over the internet, although I'll come back to the fact that in some ways you can. But I think what's really clear is what people miss and what they appreciate about online worship is the sense of participation. And the more of a sense of participation there is, the more authentic it feels. And so what people are missing are not just the physical receiving and the touching and the tasting, but doing it, in proximity to you, and feeling a sense of someone else's presence, and feeling the sound of music in the pews, and all of those things. And I do, maybe we'll come to sort of what I think that means in terms of liturgy more generally. But the question I'm really focused on is in what way can online worship, because I agree with Jeremy, it's here to stay, and the mission opportunities are huge, and I think that's what you've emphasized. But in what way, what does that need to look like in a way that's going to be sustainable for folks who may choose not to or unable to be present? And so that's kind of what I'm starting to sort out.
Wow, okay, that's really interesting. And interesting that you've kind of heard that, that range of experiences, and how the range of experiences sort of leads to the next questions. It's, yeah, really interesting. So, yeah, I want to continue to pick up on that participatory element that is so central to our Anglican tradition. Jeremy, just going back to you for a moment, lots of people around St. George's are getting to know you, but we don't know who's tuning in tonight, so I'm just going to share with people a few more things that are good to know about you, which is that you know, you've had a lifelong relationship with the Anglican Church. You're somebody that I might call like Anglican royalty, just in terms of kind of the people in your life and in your family who have served the Anglican Church in a whole bunch of different ways. You're a PK, what we fondly call a PK, a preacher's kid or a priest's kid. But you have a lot of family members in a lot of different roles within the Anglican Church. And I think that's been one of the big blessings about having you working with us here at St. George's is that you get it. You get what our tradition is about, and you get what it's not about, you know, and what works and what doesn't work. You're both going to have to humor me for a moment right now, because right now I'm training for my first marathon, so everything's about running. Like, it always comes back to running right now. But I read this book at the start of my marathon training called Roar, and basically the thesis of the book is that women are not small men, which is to say that, like, women should do their training and their nutrition to work with their bodies, not against their bodies, you know, like that it's not sort of a one-size-fits-all way of training and being healthy, that you need to work with your physiology. And I keep thinking about that metaphor in terms of what you're helping us do here, because I think that you're really helping us work with our physiology, like to work with our tradition rather than against our tradition. And as David has just like pointed out, so much of our tradition is participatory. So I'd love to hear a little bit more from you, Jeremy, about how you see us using technology to work with us rather than against us.
Yeah, I think Anglican Church are starting from a position of real strength, and not. So we've talked about this before.
And I think we lose track of this, so I'm really glad that you're saying it again.
Right, and so I often, any production I'm working on, I try and take a moment to ask about what could not be created at any cost, right? And so, you know, often there's an element of a live production that is irreplaceable, like based on where it's taking place, maybe the combination of people who are together who will never be in that same space again. And really starting there, right? Like what do we have that can't be bought, basically, and using that to really inform our conception of how special something is.
Yeah.
And I think when you look at most Anglican churches, you have a physical space that is unspeakably beautiful. You have a community that has deep roots locally, who are engaged with one another. And you have a really important message that people need to hear. And so if you start from that, you're ahead of almost every other organization trying to share their message.
Can you say those three things again? Because I think that is like, those would be 3 great hashtags for all of us to keep track of. I'm going to really test it.
That was off the top of my head and was not prepared.
No, the space, the roots in the community.
Yeah, and in the community,
and the message.
Message and people who are engaged with one another. And so I think if you start from that perspective, any investment required to share worship, and I think live streaming is just part of
Yeah, for
that.
sure.
It starts to seem like a very inexpensive undertaking. You know, when you think about what you're unlocking when you do that. I think a lot of churches reacted when COVID hit and lockdown happened, and the immediate response was, well, we need to continue to reach our congregation. And then I think as it progressed and as that continued to happen, that some congregations started to see the opportunity of it all. And but I don't think they all did. You know, I think that there is a cohort of clergy who can't wait to forget it all, right? And just turn it back off. But I don't think that Anglicans are going to be happy with the tap turned off.
No.
Nor do I think it's healthy. Like, I think there's people have experienced worship in new context, like I have, you know, in a living room or in a different kind of space.
Yeah.
So I can't imagine that the future doesn't include that option anyway.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I think it's good to highlight, like, live stream isn't the only option, and that's sort of, you know, our Anglican tradition is not homogenous either, so there really are ways of kind of tailoring the technology of that works for each congregation in terms of, again, working with them rather than against them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, however it's accomplished. You know, I think when I talk to people and they share with me, you know, what was it that I'd have brought them to church or back to church or something. You know, it was a moment of grace that was often quite banal. You know, it was like something sort of caught their attention in a service, or something happened that was unique for them.
Yeah.
And when we share worship online, who knows, you know, what's connecting with people. Like, it's really casting a much wider net. And so, yeah, and I think younger people, like, who have grown up in a completely digital world, right? Like, I'm guessing that we had analog childhoods and digital adulthoods.
Yeah.
So we have memories of what life was like before, although it seems like harder and harder to imagine.
To imagine, yeah.
So I think that, you know, the metaphor that I think is most resonant is that it opens the church doors wide to people who maybe wouldn't enter a physical space as an introduction.
I think that's very true. I actually, the cover of the camera picked this up. Speaking of analog, I wore retro socks intentionally, because these are the old CBC logo.
Right.
And if you're a certain age, probably not Martha's age, but my age, you'll recognize the logo.
Absolutely.
But you know, it's so, as I sort of see, as people sort of figured out what to do in March and April of 2020, sort of some people went synchronous, you know, and some people went asynchronous. So some people, it was about, you know, what happens here, live streaming, so you're participating at the time, and some, you know, did a recording and then broadcast. And then the other way to split it was participatory or not. So my parish went kind of old CBC mode, you know, do a fine product and then throw it up there. The parish next door, which is also a Eucharistic-centered parish, they went to Zoom worship. And I think the advantage of that was the sense of participation, seeing faces. The disadvantage of that could be the openness, right? It's harder to get in that room, and then problems with Zoom bombing. You know, and some of my research is showing that people were experimenting about this, you know, 10, 15 years ago. You know, avatars, you know, receiving the bread and wine. I mean, that stuff was happening long before. So I just wonder your thoughts about where technology and where, you know, where we might go in terms of coming back to this business about participation, of how that has become so important to Anglicans, and where might that go?
Well, I think you hinted at it earlier, that there is this Venn diagram, right, of people who will exclusively participate in a physical live service, right? People who will only participate online, and then somewhere in, you know, some sort of mushy middle, and people who move between the two. I don't think that there is a technological. I don't think there's going to be like a sea change, presto technology answer. I think rather we need to catch up and use technology to share what's already happening here. And I don't think it replaces, I really don't. Like, I don't think it does. I mean, the Zoom thing's great because everyone uses it, everyone understands it, especially now.
Yeah.
Especially now, yeah.
But I think you're right that it's a bit closed, right? Like it doesn't invite people in for the first time. Right? It's a bit of a club. And Zoom bombing. I mean, it hasn't happened to me, but I've seen some horrific.
Yeah.
It's like absolutely. And then even our elected officials in Parliament can't get it together on Zoom.
That's another story.
Keep the video off.
Well, I mean, strike one. Okay.
Yeah,
Strike
yeah.
two.
Yeah.
So I think where it's going is that people interact with things they care about, both virtually, like somehow virtually, and online and in person. And that's true for family relationships. I haven't lined up at a bank in a year. So I think that the answer is right there in front of us, and we need to understand how these things aren't frills, and that we need to offer Anglicans the opportunity to engage both in person and online. And I don't think that there's any technological advancement that's going to replace Eucharist in, like actual church.
Is there, if I could just follow up, is there a middle place? Because one of the things we discovered is that people also appreciate the opportunity to participate in something by recording at home and then it being spliced together.
Sure.
So, starting to imagine what would in-person worship look like where you've got people in the space and people in their own spaces, and somehow that becomes one.
Right. Well, I mean, we've done a lot of work with corporate clients, and one of the things that happened, in fact, WWE, like the wrestling, which is a great place. Like, believe it or not, wrestling is a great place to look for whiz-bang technology because they've got the budget and they've been driving it for years, right? Like, whereas Bruce Springsteen might show up at Madison Square Garden with 20 trucks, the wrestling comes in with like 50. It's incredible, right? And one of the things they did is they put a screen in each seat that people could buy a ticket to be there.
Really?
Believe it or not. The NBA did something similar. This is a version of that.
I was going to say, yeah.
And for a lot of corporate events, we'd put up an LED wall and then do many, many small, so that there's the appearance that there are many, many people participating. So, I mean, I think you're right. Like, there's some version of that. I mean, my overwhelming sense is that I don't want to see a screen in an Anglican church, ever. I don't. I really don't.
I like
Don't
how
take it to
old
some
school
churches.
you are in some ways.
Yeah.
But that's often not it's how the screen has been deployed. It's not the screen itself, right? It's like underpowered projectors at 10 a.m. in the morning is not great for seeing. So yeah, I think some way to incorporate. Like, I know there are choirs, right? That each one, people record their own part, and then that gets. And there's no reason why that couldn't be incorporated down the road, right? Like, you could have a virtual choir of people all around the world who put something together that then gets played.
Yeah. No, that's some interesting possibilities that you're pointing at there, and seeing what the NBA and wrestling's done. That's helpful.
Well, what are you hearing, or what were you hearing in your research? Like, what were some things that were just happening organically that, like, I think people have that drive to participate. So how are people just experiencing that?
Well, I think that the elephant in the room for Anglicans is what has been called virtual communion.
Right.
I mean, early on in the pandemic, Diana Butler-Bass, big figure, came out and said, this notion that we can't celebrate the Eucharist because we can't gather. And that was, in fact, the official position of bishops in our part of the world for a while. If none may, then none can. And she said that's actually hoarding the body of Christ, the bread of life. And she said, so what's wrong with bringing your bread and wine to your laptop? And What I discovered is that there were people who did that, but they were afraid to admit it.
Right.
And I started to put my purple stole on and say, you can tell me that, and I'm not going to report you to the diocese and the police. Yeah, and it's interesting because I think that gave people a sense of the tactile, and eating and drinking, and so then you get into huge. They're theological questions, but they're also questions about communication. How do we put confines on the grace of God? And can the grace of God, I mean, if we do believe, which I think we do, that it's by the power of the Spirit that bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ, however that happens, to what limits can we or should we put on that? Can God work through pixels? And I mean, I think it's already established that God can be missional, that God's mission can be done through pixels. I mean, Jeremy said that. So where do we put those lines? And I think it's going to take a long time or some period of time for the church to sort that out. But I think that is going to become a key question in this conversation.
Well, and I think what's really helpful about your research is just identifying kind of the bubbling up of something, right? Like, I don't think that we're going to solve all those questions here tonight, but it sure is interesting to know that that's like bubbling up just in people's like hunger, like just out of their hunger to worship and to participate in worship. This is what has been organically happening in some places. And
we know, if we know that that's how change in the church happens, it happens organically from the bottom up. Phyllis Tickle talked about every 500 years there's a big shakeup in the church. And the last one, she says, was the Reformation. And the Reformation was made possible because of the printing press. Without the printing press and people be able to have Bibles in their homes, you wouldn't have had the Reformation. It wouldn't have happened. So I think that this, now technology is driving this, and we don't yet know where it will go and what the confines will be.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. But what I really appreciate about our conversation tonight is, like, in the midst of all that shakeup and all of these new things that are happening and that we've kind of been forced to figure out, like, the key questions kind of stay the same, right? Like how do we open our doors? How do we open our doors more broadly? Like, if we believe that we have something to share, then how do we share it? And I just like really appreciate the basics of what you kind of started with, Jeremy. Like that we have these places of prayer, like that are soaked in prayer and soaked in the faith of the people. Like, in many ways, our churches haven't been shut for the past year and a half. Like, I really get kind of upset when I see church signs saying, like, church is closed, go online. Well, the church isn't closed. It's not closed. Like, we've still been opening the church. We've still been motivated by that desire to share this community of faith and this message that for us is life-saving. The basics are kind of right there.
Cycle. And it became particularly important during the pandemic as people in Toronto especially had very little outdoor space. And media report after media report said Lakeshore closed. Well, Lakeshore was not closed.
Yeah.
Lakeshore was more open than it's ever been before, but a certain segment of the population has been disadvantaged by this closure. And all these urbanists who I follow kept saying it's not closed. Look, there are more people out than ever. And so I think you're absolutely
That's a
right.
really good,
So I think you're absolutely right. And then I think there's a temptation to look to technology to solve problems.
Right.
And I really don't. I don't think that's going to help. I think what is it? God so loved the world, he didn't send a committee. Right. But I do think it's a way to amplify, to extend to share. I also think that your point about the Reformation is absolutely correct. I think the history of the church is there's a parallel technology story, right? Which is, had the technology to record on papyrus stories had not existed, we wouldn't be sitting here today. So, at every point, Christians have been using the best technology they had available to them to record and share stories that they found to be important. So this is nothing new, really. It's just, the details have changed.
The details have changed, yeah.
I'm curious, you said a few minutes ago that you never want to see a screen in an Anglican church. And I will confess to some affinity to that point of view, although there are lots.
I know.
So you're a tech guy, and
Yeah.
you're thinking creatively about technology, but there's something about having a screen in a church, if you imagine this wonderful space here at St. George's or others, that you're holding back. And I just kind of push you on that, if
Sure.
you could kind of sort out those two things.
Yeah, so my question about the screens in churches, what problem were they trying to solve?
Yeah.
So
Heavy hymn books.
heavy hymn
I know
books.
the answer to this question.
Heavy hymn books. Right. And so I think there are, accessibility things are important, right? Like maybe there's, I just haven't seen it done well, and it is jarring, and I find interrupts a space that is not broken. And so there's often, if a hymn book's too heavy, then the church should ask a parishioner to donate 10 iPads, which are backlit, and people can expand type. The other problem is that the obsolescence, like a projector bulb, degrades so slowly that if you're accustomed to it, you don't see it happening, right? Which is why a lot of ambient light, right, at 10 a.m. on Sunday mornings tends to be bright, right? And then the bulb is, the projector's typically underpowered, and then the bulb slowly degrades, and what you're looking at is very difficult to see. And then you add the fact that often the words that are on the screen do not match the words that are being spoken. And if there's a way to drag me out of any sort of worship mode, that's a quick way to do it. So I think that's an example of technology being used to solve a problem that wasn't really identified.
Yeah, that thing of the dimming bulb sounds like eyesight in your mid-50s. You don't realize you're seeing less and less.
Yeah.
If I could just,
Yeah,
I don't want to, one of the things I don't know whether you two are familiar with the Dean of Canterbury in England, but Dean Robert Willis, he has become an international phenomenon by every morning going into his garden with, cats and pigs and chickens, and sitting on a bench with his tea tray and saying a modified morning prayer and talking about nature or talking about the day. And I discovered all kinds of people who have just been completely entranced and make that part of their daily discipline. So there's an interesting thing there about daily prayer. I mean, people are getting back or getting into the habit of daily prayer. But some folks said to me, there's a deep tradition there, and that's why I kind of thought about your comment about screens. Like it's deeply traditional, and yet it's innovative. But there also was a sense of intimacy that some folks found in that, with chickens wandering through and cats sipping at the cream, that they weren't necessarily finding when we took what we were doing on a Sunday morning and broadcast it.
Right.
And that's I'm still trying to probe through what's going on there. I wonder if you have some insights.
I do. I think when things are authentic, they work. Yeah. So I think it probably starts with that was a comfortable place for him. That wasn't the first time a cat walked across his. And I think that was, but it also is shot professionally, and it's mixed professionally, right? Like it's not an iPhone, right? So I think that often that's the difference.
Okay.
It's not just the area; it's like how is it happening? Because a lot of churches have an architectural challenge, which is there's no obvious place to put a camera, and so you wind up with what we call security camera looks, right? Where people are sort of peering from awkward angles.
Right.
And so I think there might be an element that people are experiencing for the first time, which is a real connection with someone through a screen.
And that's like another piece that we've chatted about over the past year or 6 months is just how much like technology is really at its best when you're not thinking about it. Like when it's just facilitating this intimacy and this connection, but in a way that doesn't seem to be present at all.
Right.
And that's the magic of the work that you do, that lots of us as kind of lay people have no idea of the
Right. Well, I think
the different questions that go into that.
I often think, successful production is like a good party, right? So at a good party, when you leave the party and someone says, well, how was it? You say, well, it was great, right? And if you say, well, why was it great? You might have to think about it. And then you might make something up, right? You might just sort of latch onto something you remembered, right? Like, the canapes were really good, But you don't
Right.
notice that the server saw you enjoying the canapes and made sure that they came by where you were standing 5 times. But if you're at a party and something's off, right? Like if the light is too bright or if the music's too loud or, those are often, you still might not identify it, but you wouldn't enjoy it sort of as much. But we saw this here. So St. George has been streaming for 6 or 7 years, right?
Yeah, 5 or 6 years.
So it's not a new thing. But when the new system was installed, there was an immediate improvement. And I think it was like the second Sunday, someone chimed in and said, I'd really like to see more of the altar, right? So immediately, right, without any prompting, someone understood, or didn't understand rather, how much had gone into creating that improvement, and we're now just sort of cherry picking. Which, to me, that sort of specific criticism is a huge compliment and an endorsement of the approach.
Yeah,
Because if somebody,
I like that.
because like you're tempted to go back to them and say, "Are you kidding me? Like, look how much work has been done." When in fact, no, they're sitting there and everything's so clear and everything sounds good that they can just they want to art direct.
That's really helpful. So, you're celebrating high production values as really important, but not ones that get in the way. And it makes me think about liturgy. Maybe good liturgy is where you actually don't realize that a lot of thought and planning has gone into it, but that it's happening in a kind of authentic way that doesn't get in the way. And so you're helping me understand how we do that from a technological point of view.
Yeah, we need to. Yeah, someone once said to me that a janitor's doing their best work when they don't seem to be doing anything at all.
Right.
Right? Because everything's in order and everything's clean. And I think not getting in the way and finding out how to do that tastefully, which is one of the problems I think that a lot of churches have when they reach out for some sort of AV assistance. And that is that they order an expensive pizza and don't understand that what they really need are cooking lessons and a pizza oven in the back. And I've heard from clergy who have said, we had an awful experience because we bought the system and there were cameras, but no one knew how to run it. Well, that's a failure of probably the AV company for not understanding that there needed to be some more hand-holding to really make it work.
What advice would you have for a smaller place or a less resourced congregation to find their way in the post-pandemic world?
So I would say you need to professionalize the position or professionalize the skill set. So you need a critical mass of willing and enthusiastic people. There are Grammy-winning records now that were made in bedrooms. I know that some action sequences in Hollywood have been shot on iPhones. So it's the technology is out there, but what I would say is that if you were able to establish a small group of committed people, maybe one of the decisions they would make is let's take the iPad off the stand in front of the pulpit and find a better way to use that, or somewhere else to put it. Or what happens when we maybe change a single light bulb from a cold LED to a warm, there are small, it's incremental changes that could be made. And then I would say I would consider that kind of infrastructure investment to be as critical as a roof or furnace.
Not a
So-
frill.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
like
And maybe
that.
something that's part of a long-term capital.
Yeah. Well, the other thing, if I just say quickly, is that you're also, I think, pointing to how being part of that can be a ministry in participation itself. So participation can be behind the camera or figuring those things out, just the way, being a choir member or an intercessor. There's a whole opportunity there
Sure.
to engage.
Well, and particularly younger people. I mean, if that's a challenge that the church is facing, I mean, I think it's a great way to harness some energy. I mean, the Pentecostals and the evangelicals figured this out a long time ago, right? And so they're light years ahead because they've been doing this. But they don't have the advantage that Anglicans have, which is, they're often starting from boxes, which require lighting, right? Which require concert PAs,
Right.
which require all of that stuff. It's not like, there's a reason sort of Christian rock didn't emanate from Anglican churches, because it didn't need to, like the musical tradition is so strong. So they're trying everything they can, and there's no budget on earth that could create this, right? So I think, starting from a really strong place.
I think that's like so important for our Anglican tradition to hear, because I think that we often feel like we're light years behind the big box churches, and feel kind of apologetic about what we have to offer. But I think framing it in terms of strength, and I think framing it in terms of that critical investment, like that it's just as important as the roof. It's not a frill. It's just like completely, intimately, intricately connected to our calling to share the faith that's in us. Like whatever we have in our relationship with God in this community of faith is not meant to be kept for ourselves. It's supposed to be shared.
Well, and we've never been in an easier, and these are lessons that were learned, like that booth up there, right, was a broadcast booth for radio, right?
It was, yeah.
So, it's not like this is a new idea. It's
Right.
just, it's never been more accessible. And I just like to come back to the point, like, you never know what moment is going to grab somebody, right?
Yeah,
And I think
yeah.
particularly, with weddings and, people who might not be members of a congregation, but when there's a major life event, a birth, a wedding, a death, often that's when new people arrive. Well, there are going to be people watching that ceremony who aren't flying from Latvia or New Zealand or something. And so there's a real opportunity, I think, to reach people through those moments that will be missed if we don't have the means to share them.
Yeah. And, I think that is, that bears up. Like, you never know what banal moment is the one that clicks for somebody in terms of just hearing that invitation in a new way.
I think about St. Peter's on the Rock on Stony Lake, where when I was young, my father gave us a vacation by working. And I remember one thing about it was that it was my favorite church service because I could look out the wooden they weren't windows, just wooden doors that opened on the side of the church, and watch the lake and watch the boats go by. And I think I absorbed more of what was happening because I wasn't straight ahead staring in a traditional church service. There was something else going on. And I think that is a similar thing for the context in which worship is occurring online. Because I think if you can experience it somewhere where maybe you are more comfortable, maybe it's happening at your own schedule, right? Maybe there might be an opportunity for something to reach someone in a way that doesn't in this traditional in-person environment. I think, I just think about the second cup of coffee I had before your sermon, and I thought, wow, this never happened. Like, I've never had a coffee in my hand.
Right.
It's wonderful. It's not better, it's not worse, it's just different and interesting.
And I think, we know that people are there's great church tourism going on now.
Right.
You know, you can sort of watch something and then you're at National Cathedral in Washington, and then you're overseas somewhere. So it's making the church smaller, and I suspect flatter as well, and maybe an opportunity to learn in a way that would have been impossible before this.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, I mean, even just the YouTube autoplay feature, right? Like as soon as the St. George's stream ends, all of a sudden it's the Pittsburgh Catholic Cathedral or something starts. And if you're not turning, if you're streaming to a television or something, you need to be on it, not to make sure you don't see it. It's just this. You're right. Like, when would I have ever in my life watched 10 minutes of a Catholic mass in Pittsburgh?
In Pittsburgh, yeah.
And that's another thing when research was showing up is someone said to me, the slider button is the sort of the work of the devil. We don't. Some statistics are showing that a certain percentage of people actually don't watch the whole thing. They do cherry pick. So they will, they really want to hear the sermon, or they really don't want to hear the sermon.
Right.
They always want to hear Martha, but in other places, and they want the music. They don't like that hymn. So that's the other interesting thing that I think we're still figuring out in terms of the analytics of what is the audience like, how stable is it, and to what extent are people picking.
Right. Well, I mean, I imagine it would be the same if we could measure daydreams.
Well, that's right. Yes.
Yeah, that's
yes.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And someone said to me on that point, well, when I tune out of the sermon, at least then I can look at the window, or I can look here, or I can look at my neighbor.
Right.
So that's where the high technology stuff, and you can even see that, when a royal wedding or the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral, which high production values. But there was, you were seeing all kinds. You were seeing people. You were seeing parts of Windsor Castle.
Yeah, that's
So
true.
that kind of distraction was given a place.
Right. Well, we've been talking about, the ultimate church service is when the royal family has a funeral and the BBC has carte blanche. Like that, because I think if I were to point at the single greatest example of a live streamed sort of Anglican tradition church service, that funeral is what I would point to.
And it had an impact.
Just marvelous. But it's not TV, it's not, but it is, like from the camera back, it is, like the system doesn't know what it's covering, which is why the operators become so important, is that they understand nuance. And the other thing that I've been noticing is that a lot of the finer movements that aren't maybe visible from the pews are now, like the preparation of the gifts, for instance.
Yeah.
That's something that you can really see. That isn't just sort of a series of small motions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's like, the difference between seeing opera in person from the fifth ring, where our seats are, or going to the theater and seeing the Met on a screen, and where you could see the facial expressions and all the details of the costumes and so on.
Have you done that in a theater?
I've not done it, actually, but I know people who do.
I went and I saw one, and just having a nice loud PA was great.
Yeah, I've heard lots of people swear by it.
I was ready to be very disappointed.
Yeah.
It was fantastic.
But it felt authentic to you.
Yeah, well, it had impact. Loud and yeah. Also the Met.
Right. But it comes back to authenticity.
Yeah. Okay, so as we come back to authenticity, are there any other burning questions you have, David? Do you feel like you've gotten to ask Jeremy the things that were on your mind?
Well, it's a great conversation. I just try to imagine, what was it like in the last pandemic 100 years ago? I mean, first there wasn't the technology, but I don't think that, and we know the closures of churches was much shorter, but I'm not sure there was the same sense of missing participation. And I think that's really been something that's developed in liturgy since in the liturgical movement of the 20th century, where we've come to honor participation in a way. Because back 100 years ago, the priest did everything in the service. So it wasn't,
that's true.
I don't think, even if you imagine the technology there, I don't think the response has been shaped by how we've been shaped liturgically. And as I may say, the liturgical movement of the 20th century has done its work.
Yeah.
Because we just value that. It's taken for granted. And now we're finding out technologically how we can make that meaningful and authentic.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah.
I think there's also because we can, we should. I think true creativity is often the result of real limits. Like George Martin effectively created the 8-track studio with the Beatles by adding a 4-track to a 4-track and syncing them together. But right up to that point, they had to do things with 4 tracks. It's remarkable to think about what they did with those limits that still stand up. So I think, there are the physical limitations of the space, but then within that, all sorts of rich opportunity, and it's timeless, in that way. So yeah, I'm excited for what's next. I think the flattening of the church is a really interesting idea. We talked about how maybe parish borders are going to be less real as people tune into services that they like. But I do think that every church has its little personality.
Yeah, for sure.
Kind of like how the Montreal Canadiens seem to know how to win.
Oh, wow, you just had to get that in there.
And the Toronto Maple Leafs, I can't believe the CN Tower was lit. I can't. With the Canadiens colors, I can't.
And tonight's conversation is
Just
taken
derailed.
total
But I guess,
left turn.
Every Canadian conversation comes back to hockey at a certain point.
but I guess what I'm trying to say is that, the small rural parish, right, does things better than the big downtown cathedral, right? And the neighborhood church does things, better than the other church down the street. So there's, I think if churches can really ask themselves questions like, what do we do really, really well?
Yeah.
And then use that as a starting point for sharing something,
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of opportunity, and people really want to connect, and they need ways to do it that don't involve parking and walking through the doors in order to do it every time.
Yeah, I think that's just such an important bottom line, because it's been woven through our entire conversation tonight, that that desire to participate, that desire to connect, that desire for community, and all of those things are real. None of it is virtual. It's all real, whether it's happening online or in person. And if we can keep kind of coming back to those central questions of how we share the realness, then there's all kinds of opportunities in front of us in terms of how we do that. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both for our conversation tonight. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, David. You can't see him, but thank you, Scott, who is behind the camera and running the live stream tech tonight. And you briefly saw Matt also helping out tonight and stepping in with a battery issue. So thank you, Matt. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight or whenever you're tuning in to this conversation. We hope that you'll join us next week. Next week, Scott and I will be interviewing Archdeacon Val Kerr, who is an honorary assistant here at St. George's, but she is also the Archdeacon for Indigenous Ministries and Truth and Reconciliation here in the Diocese of Niagara. And we're going to be having a really important conversation around next steps in truth and reconciliation. Thank you, everyone, for being part right now of how together we get to eat and talk and participate in the sweetness of life.